Hi, everyone. This is the Strong Mind podcast, and you're listening to Hazel Finley. All right, so in this episode, I speak with Lauri Jarvilehto. He is a philosophy academic, lecturer, and writer studying flow and intuition. We focus this conversation mostly around intuition, and it's definitely more of a academic conversation, but there are some practical takeaways as well. We talk about what intuition is, creativity and intuition, the difference between system one, which is our non-conscious mind, and system two, our conscious mind, what processes in climbing require system one and system two, and how expertise allows us to commit more to system one. We talk about the difference between practical expertise and conceptualizing skills. We talk about how system two can distract us, which explains the phenomenon of choking in sport. We talk about how flow and good performances happen when the system one is online. We talk about the differences and similarities between flow and intuition, pattern recognition, the difference between instinct and intuition, and how to better access intuition and flow. And he gives us some practical tips around how to do that. All right. Thanks for listening as always, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Great. Lauri, I'm recording. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. So let's get started. It'd be cool to just hear about, first of all, why you're kind of personally interested in intuition and flow, and kind of what attracted you to these areas in the first place.
Yeah. So I mean, I've always been perplexed about the kind of like the nature of the human mind since I was like a little kid, and trying to figure out like why do we have a mind and how does it work, and I eventually ended up studying philosophy to figure these things out, and I did my PhD in epistemology, which basically focused on so the theories of knowledge that focused on this kind of like mathematical and logical knowledge. So how can we know things that don't seem to require any kind of like experiential proof or corroboration? And then that raised the question of like, that do we have these kind of like things in our mind that we're not aware of, like this kind of more intricate non-conscious mind? And it turned out that many of those kind of philosophical works that I looked into, mainly by C.I. Lewis and some works by even Immanuel Kant, kind of like led to this idea that there is this kind of like intuitive capability. And I ended up doing my postdoc work then on that topic. And at that point, I also started the research and consulting company called the Academy of Philosophy here in Finland. And I realized that many of these theories that I was studying for both my PhD and postdoc were actually also quite applicable in working life for the kinds of clients that we work with. And especially the dual processing theories of cognition. So this idea that we have these two like different systems of cognition, like the conscious system 2 and the non-conscious system 1, that have now since in the last 10 years been made very popular by especially Daniel Kahneman and others. So that really gave me a really solid model on like how to understand intuitive decision making. And I published my postdoc findings in 2015. This book published by Springer called The Nature and Function of Intuitive Thought and Decision Making, and also ended up creating a kind of model for like how can we evaluate these, like when you get an aha moment, like hey, I should do X, Y, or Z. So how can you evaluate whether they actually are like salient intuitions or like significant, like meaningful intuitions, or whether they're more like, because we also have this non-conscious instinctive capability, which isn't that amazing. Like, like for example, we have an instinctive tendency to maximize energy intake, which is fantastic if you're living in an energy scarce environment. But now we have like, the shops are full of food and chocolate. It's not, if you look around, like, it's not so amazing capability at this point. So differentiating between like particularly intuitions and instincts was, I think, one of the like the findings in my postdoc research. Yeah, so that's kind of like that since 2015 I've kind of more like segued into more practical questions, and now I'm actually like teaching like at Aalto University. I'm a professor of practice here, so more kind of like now focusing on more kind of pedagogical aspects of how to communicate these things to our students. So yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's like dig into intuition. How much do you think about flow state, by the way?
A lot. I mean, flow is like also one of the central theories in my 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 research, and it's also been one of the theory, the frameworks that I've found the most applicability, both in kind of like the business world when I was doing consulting, and also now when I'm doing teaching. And flow also, I think there's in my book there's some exploration about the like kind of relationship between intuition and flow, and I've also written a paper about that in another compilation about the flow experience. So flow is definitely like it's a very very important part of like both kind of like the way I think theoretically, but also I think just like the way I live my life. I think that's it's a really really like powerful and central frameworks that you can employ to basically live a better life.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll get into that. All right, first up, can you define intuition for us?
Yeah. So intuition is a non-conscious capability driven by experience and learning to be able to make even very or to be able to employ learned heuristics to make decisions in complicated situations and to come up with new insight, uh, even new kind of insight that may even change whole like paradigms and frameworks. So
Okay.
maybe like try to rephrase that like a little bit more simply. So intuition is your non-conscious capability of leveraging what you've learned to be able to manage situations and to create new stuff.
Okay. And the sort of the key part there is non-conscious, right? So it's like how it feels like something's just come out of nowhere. That's sort of how it feels to us, right? But it's actually come from non-conscious processing that we're not consciously aware of.
Exactly.
Okay. And like most of what we do is non-conscious, right? So like when I walk from here to across the room, all my muscles and everything are moving in certain ways and I'm not aware of the intricacies of that movement. Why do we not call that intuition?
Uh, well, I mean, intuition, I think, is ultimately defined in terms of the outputs, and the outputs are basically, like I said, I think I would basically limit them to these kind of like decision making and insight.
So
So
like
just like
novel.
using our, yeah. So
Okay.
using system one for anything like, so system one is also involved in, you might argue that it's involved in breathing and like, all kinds of like, like when I'm moving my hands like this, when I'm doing something, I'm not really like, my system two, my conscious mind is not saying that now move left hand, now move right hand, but it happens more or less automatically. And so there's this like massive amount of parallel neural processes ongoing in the nervous system, the brain, and elsewhere in the body that usually like don't require conscious intervention. And when this is kind of like interesting in terms of like flow. So one might even think that consciousness is a kind of problem-solving function. So insofar as everything works, you don't need to be conscious. And only the situations when like where you have an anomaly, something that doesn't work the way that your kind of like nervous system is geared up to fit with that space. So then you have to start thinking, oh, okay, I wonder how does this go? And if you think about the sports experience, for example, like, and if you're playing a game that you've played a lot, most of the time you don't really think about like, I wonder, should I pass on to the player at the left or the player at the right? Or like, I don't know if you're doing like rock climbing or whatever, like, that should I place my hand here or here or here? But you have the kind of capability of navigating that terrain based on your learned heuristics. But then if something not, just like let's say that you're climbing and all of a sudden the cliff breaks off or like something happens that's unexpected, then you have to start thinking, okay, so what do I do next? So what would be the best course of action? Because then you don't have the heuristic, you don't have the kind of like organism environment fit in that situation where the kind of the way you are geared up and the way the environment, for example, the rock face is geared up, they don't fit together, and that's when we need to become conscious about it. So in that sense, I mean, it's kind of like it ultimately boils back down to decisions. I mean, many people use the word intuition in a way that I am intuitively using my hands when I'm talking or something like that, and it's perfectly okay. But then if you want to be a little bit more academic about it, then you need to limit it to some scope. And basically, in this case, I've usually limited it to insight and decision making.
Okay, it sounds as well like it's when there's like a challenge. So you mentioned problem solving. Is it also when like there's a challenge required of us? So like that's obviously a key aspect of flow, is that it sort of requires that we be challenged. Is that also a key aspect of intuition?
To be challenged.
Well, that like there's a sort of a struggle, like you talked about how like it's when we don't match up with the environment. It seems
Uh,
like there's often a struggle there, but
yeah,
then is there a struggle when we intuitively just randomly get an idea?
that's a great question. Um, I I would say yes and no, and maybe more emphatically yes. So basically, I mean, if you think the two type, first of all, I mean, problem solving, decision making, obviously that involves a struggle because it's kind of like there is a state of affairs as it is, a state of affairs that you desire, and then kind of like there's a gap between, and you need to either use your kind of like Keith Stanovich talks about this algorithmic mind. You need to be able to figure out the kind of like the steps to get from what is to what ought to be. But then intuition can also fill in that gap. So you can sort of sleep over it, let your system one sort of just run its way, and then some suitable heuristic may pop up and you will be able to bridge the gap. Um, and then the reason why I said not necessarily is if you think about creative insight. So I'm for example, I used to do my first 10 years in professional life. I was a professional musician, and I still do a lot of music as a hobby. So I may be walking down the street and all of a sudden a melody pops into my head. So I'm not really I'm not in a struggle to find a melody. It's not it's not part of my work anymore. It's just something that I enjoy doing tremendously. Whenever something like that pops into my mind, I just dig out some, note taking gear or write it down or hum it into my phone or something like that. So in that sense, you could say that in those situations, you don't need to have a kind of a problem to solve or struggle to address. Now, having said that, there is a kind of a twist to this. So in a sense, kind of if you are geared into a creative trade, so you're making music or literature or painting or something, in a sense, that kind of the kind of the attitude or tendency of wanting to create something does, in a sense, you could argue that it creates a type of problem like the white canvas problem, that it's there, you might not be employed by doing that, you still desire to be able to create something new, and that desire creates a conflict, and the conflict manifests itself in inside. So that's I think that's a sort of fair enough um interpretation of the question. uh I'm sort of I'm ambivalent right now about that whether or not that is a sensible distinction or not, but I think it's a possible one anyway.
Yeah, and I guess if it's not a hallmark of intuition, that could be a difference between intuition and flow, right? Because we have to be challenged to get into flow.
Exactly.
Um, it would be great if you could just define system 1 and 2, because I don't think we've done that.
Yeah. So system one is our non-conscious mind. It's the entire system responsible for motor control, for heuristics, biases, associative thinking, learning, uh, semantics, like how meaning is given to words and stuff like that. It's basically, according to most of the research, it's shared by most animals. So most every animal can be attributed to system one, obviously, because you have motor function and problem-solving function, stuff like that. And it's evolutively quite old. So we're talking about several millions of years. The system two is, and one critical thing is that system one has massive processing capability and is capable of like simultaneously parallel processing like a significant amount of information. And which is easily demonstrated that I can wave my hands and talk at the same time because I don't need to consciously guide my hands to be able to do that. Or even be someone like I'm a trained pianist, so I can even basically play a complicated song by Chopin or something like that, and then have a conversation at the same time. So I can do this parallel processing because the playing itself doesn't require much. Once I've learned the song, doesn't require much attention. The system two is our conscious mind. It's delimited by our working memory capability. So basically, our working memory can process about 3 to 5 units of information at the same time. And that's, for example, one of the reasons why people who are working with information-heavy jobs, like working with computers, like spreadsheets, stuff like that, get so stressed in the work when there's kind of noise, background noise, and stuff like that, because we can't really focus on more than a handful of things at the same time before our working memory capability blows up. System two is it's typical to humans. Depending on some arguments, or some research, it's also shared by some of the higher primates. So there's some research pointing that dolphins may have something akin to a system two. Gorillas, chimpanzees definitely do. I mean, you can have a conversation with them once they learn sign language. It's basically driving our algorithmic thinking, so the capability of doing operations like how much is 23 times 11. So I mean, if you do an operation like 2 plus 2, it actually it's not driven by the system two or the algorithmic mind because you've learned it by heart, so the answer immediately pops into your head. You don't have to use an algorithm to calculate that. Whereas with 23 times 11, unless you're a math genius, you need to go okay, so 10 times 23 is 230, and 1 times 23 is 23, so it's 230 plus 23, so it's 253. So this is the algorithmic mind approach. So you're actually employing your conscious mind to parse these kind of action steps to get into the conclusion. And then Keith Stanovich, one of the prominent authors, one of the people who actually coined this system one, system two distinction, argues that there's also a reflective component to system two, so our capability of being aware of, for example, this conversation, or you can stop and think so what am I actually thinking? And then you can, William James, talk about this stream of consciousness. So you can be aware of these ideas popping in and out of your consciousness, pretty much at their own accord. And so the system two is the conscious mind, its processing capability is really limited. So when system one, it's really hard to measure the processing capability of system one because the brain isn't a computer. The brain is based on these kind of network structures between neurons or brain cells. So we can't really establish a kind of set figure for system one processing power. System two, however, because we know it's about 3 to 5, so we can say it's about 40 bits per second. There's an interesting paper from the 1980s where this researcher, Manfred Zimmermann, came up with this way of calculating the information carrying capacity of the human nervous system. So they analyzed how many nerve endings do we have because you can, when you dissect the body, you can see how many nerve endings you have starting from, the finger or the eyes or the ears or whatever. And it turns out that based on Zimmermann's calculations, we can process at least about 11.2 million bits of sensory information per second. So that means that just based on sensory information, our system two and system one have a processing discrepancy of 1 per 280,000. So kind of to simplify it a bit, it means roughly that for every conscious thought you have at any given second, your system one is employed in processing about 280,000 other operations non-consciously, which may then pop into your head like, unannounced in the middle of the night. You wake up 3 a.m. Oh, bummer, I need to send that email in the morning. Or like, oh, wow, now I got that, like, I've been thinking about this for like weeks, and now I, like Friedrich Kekulé discovering the structure of this kind of, what was it, like, by this molecule, by like, dreaming about this snake that's biting its own tail, this Ouroboros, the benzene molecule. So that's kind of like, the types of things that the system one is capable of providing us with. So, but yeah, to make a long story short, system two is the conscious mind, limited, relatively new, evolutively typical only to humans and some like other advanced species. System one, huge processing power, evolutively old, basically extends to at least all animals that we know about, and then beyond that, it becomes pretty academic as a discussion.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. I guess other people might have heard it as like the implicit and the explicit system. And then if we sort of like, if we try and relate this back to climbing, so like sometimes when you're climbing or, doing a sport, ideally we want to be in system one, right? Because we have more of that processing power and it's faster. But then I guess sometimes in climbing, there's like problem solving that might require more explicit reasoning. What's the role of like expertise in this? Is it that the more of an expert you are, the more of the processing required by an activity is under system one rather than system two?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the short answer is that yes, the more an expert you are, like, the more you can commit to system one. There's a couple of like, sort of like clarifications or like details about that. So the first one is that it's perfectly feasible for somebody to learn a skill without being able to conceptualize that skill. So you ask, some like world famous rock musicians, like, that what is that chord you're playing in that song, that, that hit song of yours, and some of these people might not be able to say, like, I don't, it's just, this. So you can show your fingers on the fretboard and what you do with your strumming hand, but if you ask, like, what is the kind of music theoretical explanation to that chord, if you haven't learned the music theory, you can't tell. So I mean, I'm not an expert in climbing, but extrapolating from these to climbing, you could think about it like, that once you have sufficient expertise, I mean, somebody might learn just to climb whatever just by practicing enough and learning all these kind of like nuances of motion that you need to be able to, like, how you grasp a piece of like rock, like cliff face or stuff like that, and then you can climb wherever. But if somebody asks you, like, so what is the technique that you use to climb, you might not have the conceptual expertise.
Yeah, that definitely happens.
Yeah, there's practical expertise, which is simply by just practice and repetition and experience, you create these system one structures that enable you to navigate a complicated environment like the cliff face. And then there's like theoretical expertise, where you can actually denote these practices and applications with a conceptual framework or theoretical framework that you can then use to share these. Because otherwise, like, I mean, if you don't have a theoretical understanding of topic, the only way you can share it with other people is by showing them how it's done.
Yeah.
But then you have a theoretical understanding, you can say that, like, once again, I have to go back to something I know, so I can say that, that, like, the once you've learned the E major and the G major and the D major and the A major on the guitar, like, the basic chords, then you can start expanding and, like, go into the sevenths and la la la. And now if I have somebody who's learned this, I don't need to show them, like, what do I do with my left hand,
Yeah.
A major seventh, but they will understand the kind of like what notes need to go into that. And I think moving back to this like sports example, like, so it could be like, that how you're using your hands, like, if there's a particular grip that you're using, or like, like one thing that I've taught my kids, like I have 5 small kids, so one thing I've taught them since they were small was kind of like, whenever you're climbing, you should use this 3-point system, like, that you have always 3 limbs attached to whatever you're climbing. And none of the
climbing heuristic.
Exactly. But it's amazing because like my wife was so afraid about like, that they'll come down when they're climbing. Like our daughter was especially like notorious about it because she would see a YouTube video about somebody climbing this like really tall lamppost, and then 5 minutes later, like the door slams and we go out into the yard and she's like climbed into the top of this lamppost. So, but none of them has ever fell because, like, my dad was a mountain climber, so he taught us this
Okay.
kind of 3-point system when we were kids. And it's pretty clever. Like, if you have 3 limbs attached to whatever you're climbing, usually, like, basically the surface needs to break in order for you to fall. So that's I think,
Yeah.
like a parenting rule, or sure.
If your holds are good enough, yeah. So can the system, okay, so the way like I think of it is it's like system one is always online, right?
Yep.
It's like always online. And system two is sometimes online. And system two coming online, can that distract you? Basically, like, can it like make your functioning poorer because you've moved what should be in system one into system two?
Absolutely. So in sports research, there is this very well researched phenomenon known as the choking
Yeah.
effect. So basically, like, I think there was like, there's some stuff I read about Tiger Woods back in the day. Like, he used to be like the #1 golf player in the world, and then he got into this kind of divorce scandal thing. And his performance just plummeted. And you can imagine, like, that you're there in the golf field and you have this intricate, like immensely nuanced capability of like how you're holding the golf club and like, what is the way you swing it, and you've done like thousands and thousands of repetitions, and you have this kind of like, these neural pathways optimized for that action, which is perfect if you let those neural pathways do their job. But then if your constant flashes back to the, oh shoot, there was another tabloid writing that thing about, that other thing, and then you're thinking about that. So all of a sudden, the whole motor function, like, the kind of like that should be running autonomously, is inhibited by the system two coming online. And there's interesting research, like, because system two is often associated, and this is a little, like, you have to take this a little with a bit of grain of salt, because like, our capability of actually investigating the neural correlates of this phenomena is not that amazing right now. And often, like, this discussion gets reduced into this, what's called neurobabble. So you kind of like quote that neural pathways, la la la, the brain does la la la. But actually, if you think about, like, our imaging methods are still quite crude. We have EEG that can register some like electrical activity, basically around the kind of like the cerebral cortex. We have, like, I mean, the magnetic imaging systems are pretty amazing. Like fMRI, you can image blood flows in the brain, but you can always kind of like, there's a kind of like extrapolations from extrapolations when you get to an actual argument about these things. So you have to kind of be a bit reserved about this. But having said that, there is, there is actually, like, interesting research that goes to show that at least some part of system two, in terms of your capability of focusing and being conscious about things, some aspects of working memory, so they're associated with the prefrontal cortex area. So basically around your forehead, like the stuff in the brain behind your forehead. And now there's some research that goes to show that when people experience flow, they have it's been a while since I looked into this, but they have, I think, reduced blood flow to the prefrontal cortex area. So that indicates that you would have this kind of hypofrontal situation where basically your frontal cortex is not running like at full speed. And that means that basically it would correlate with the phenomenological finding from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi that flow is associated with this. There's a really beautiful quote in his book Flow from 1990, that he says that, like, the loss of self-consciousness in flow doesn't mean the loss of self nor the loss of consciousness, but simply the loss of consciousness of self. And this kind of like aligns quite nicely with these hyperfrontality findings, like, that basically system two being driven by the working memory, which seems to have some correlates with the prefrontal area. So you have less activity there. So that means that the rest of the neural network elsewhere in the brain and the body get to carry on like autonomously without this. But the caveat there is like, that this, and I actually used to think back in the day before I was informed by, actual neuroscientists actually doing this research. So the danger is that you start thinking about the frontal area as a kind of a command center, but that's actually not how the brain works, because the brain is like, it's really intricately networked organ with, like, if you think about it, the current understanding is that there's about 100 billion neurons and 100,000 billion synapses, and our capability for any motor or cognitive action is dependent on the configuration of those neural networks. And whenever we do a repetition, that's a really cool thing. So just this morning, I was having this exchange with Tapane Riekki, who's a neuroscientist and psychologist in one of my companies. And so basically, he was kind of like, writing me about this kind of like that in addition to this kind of neuroplasticity, that when you repeat something, the neural network gets strengthened. There's also a pruning effect. So when you like neglect to repeat something, those neural networks dwindle. So it's as if like, your entire this like billions and billions of like nodes wide system is constantly optimizing itself to perform, to basically let through electrical current through those pathways that make the most relevant kind of nuanced action possible. So if you're moving your, if you're playing the piano and you're moving your index finger, like, in a certain way, and then like, especially if you're playing some, I've been practicing this song now by Philip Glass called The Opening from his Glassworks, which is like technically like not that, like it doesn't really require like fast motor function, like, like some songs do. It's like do 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 do. So it's kind of like, pretty slow song. But the problem with the song is that the dynamics of the song are really specific. So you have to be like, basically like, you play a little bit too loud on any of these fingers, and it kind of breaks up as music. And so that in order to be able to maintain that high level of dynamics, it actually takes, tens or hundreds of hours of repetition to get the song really into the kind of like, beautiful flow, basically. And this is like, so this morning I was thinking about it. So this is basically that when you're training this particular activity on these particular fingers, those neural networks that are like, the most pertinent to get that activity done are strengthened, and everything else gets sort of pruned away. So then another type of activity, like, becomes more and more difficult because of that effect. And that's kind of like, I think a cool part of that. So that's I mean, this is kind of like, the neuroplasticity this stuff is like really interestingly explain how expertise comes to be, and how heuristics come to be, and also biases and all of that. But I think like, we have to always like understand that these are correlates of phenomena that are really, really hard to actually measure using current level of technology. But still, like, there are some like the hyperfrontality, there are some really interesting findings that we can at least use to make some educated guesses about what could be going on.
Okay, yeah. So, like, when we're climbing, is then the idea, sort of the basic idea that through practice. So, for example, this might be something you don't know about climbing, but often you'll try a climb and you don't do it first try, and you kind of practice the movement of this climb. And this this is a process which can take days, weeks, months, years, depending on the challenge level of the climb to you. And it becomes a bit like a gymnastics routine, right? There's certain moves that you need to do on the wall that require very intricate movement, and they need to be practiced before you can kind of link them all together, a bit like a gymnastics routine. And obviously, some of that's dependent on like how strong your fingers are and how fit you are and stuff like that. But some of it's also dependent on the kind what we would call like the muscle memory of those moves. And when like our best sort of like the hardest things that we'll do, like people often say it feels automatic. And so I guess the process there is that like you start off and you need to use that system too to kind of break down the movements, analyze it, kind of problem solve it. But then when it comes to actually the performance, you want to be in system one. And I imagine that flow states in system one, and if system two comes online at all, does that mean that we are out of flow?
I think there's more. It's not like a binary thing that you either are or are not in flow. I think there's a kind of a continuum there, and you can be more or less immersed in an activity. And like obviously, like if you start going, okay, so should I put this there? Should I put it there? Then you're probably not in flow, right? So flow is like I think the interesting thing about flow is like that it is based on your like previous experience and your expertise and your understanding like of the situation. So basically that's why I mean you need to have the skill and challenge match, which is the kind of like the flow channel Csikszentmihalyi presented in his 1975 book Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. And so but yeah, I mean if you think about like that, for example, like just like, and I'm once again like being not fully versed in this field, but if you think about the kind of neuroanatomy of a handhold, so there's like, I mean, how so many muscles like in the hand to move the fingers, or like they're actually like mostly there in the like deeper in the wrist, but anyway, and then like there's like many nerve endings like sending signals so that I can do movements like that. So there's like how many ways you can use the hand to grasp something, and there's like some of this is pretty like kind of macro level. You can just like like grasp a frisbee when somebody throws it to you. But then when you have a situation where you have a highly like in a simple environment, you don't need all those nuances. But then in a complicated environment, you need to be able to figure out like how all of these different like handholds like work, like what is the best way to address that environment. And the only way you can actually like figure that out, can tell you like that your ring finger needs to be 42.7 degrees compared to your index finger, because like the amount of information you need to be able to process to perform that grasp is beyond our like system 2 capabilities. So the only way is that once you have the environment, the rock face, that you keep on like trying different configuration, then something works, and then you keep doing that again, that whatever works until you have it down to what you call muscle memory, or like as a kind of a like system 1 structure basically. And that like based on this neuroplasticity research, so that would mean that the neural networks, now that you have strengthened the neural networks conducive, and also like your muscles, like obviously you need to have strength to be able to climb, so like you've strengthened your body, your neural network, so that this particular handhold is now kind of like you can produce it without needing to put conscious effort into producing it. So before you have it in one, which is basically like the interesting thing is also that system 1 is not just, I mean, people often talk about it as if it was just brain processing, but it's actually our entire body involved in it, like and like for example, think about emotions, which like may drive our conscious thinking quite a great bit, and they come from like system 1 as well. So emotions, I mean, actually uh seem to have a very strong basis on our like the functioning of our gut. So for example, there's research that has shown that gut biome, or the bacteria in the gut, can like be predictive of depression and like other mental conditions. So it's like also like in climbing, like this it becomes neurobabble. I mean, you can say that this spot roughly here, like we have the sensory motor cortex about like in the like sort of, you put on a headband, so that would be about the sensory motor cortex. So but this spot that I'm pointing here, like the left hemisphere of my brain, would be roughly involved in operations concerning my hand. But obviously the handhold, it doesn't happen in the brain. It's the whole system that connects through my body into the hand, like how many, I don't know, bicep curls I've done in the gym, and like how many pull-ups, and like so how the whole kind of like musculoskeletal system in my body works. So that's actually like the way we can match with the environment. And then like whether you want to call all of that system 1 or not, it becomes slightly academic, but I think like it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about system 1, we're talking about the component of the mind, not a component of the brain or body. And the body has various kinds of like correlates or aspects that are represented in the functioning of the system 1 element of the mind.
I don't want to go too deep into that. Okay, so what can we do to kind of like better use intuition and better access flow? Like, and then also, like in terms of flow and intuition, is it possible to like prime ourselves so that we can be more in system one, or that we can be that we, I guess, because also that comes into this is maybe a difference between intuition and flow is that our intuition can be incorrect, right? We can have this intuitive aha moment, that's the answer, and the answer could be wrong.
Yep.
Whereas when we're in flow, usually we think of flow as being synonymous with our best performances, right? So yeah, tell me a bit about that and how we can kind of like optimize these states of functioning.
Yep. So I mean, I think the first thing is like, I mean, flow is obviously because it's a form of skilled action. It means that like, it's based on your skills being matched with the challenge at hand. And if you don't have that match, you don't really have flow because the two kind of like antitheses for flow are burnout and boredom or anxiety and boredom. So if the task at hand is too complicated or too demanding, then the answer, like the answer is to figure out how to improve your capabilities. So how to learn, how to train, how to practice, get to the point where you can actually complete that task. Obviously, if you have the like, let's say like once again going back to music, which I know pretty well. So you have a song and you just for the life of you just cut like you're playing something like I don't know, like the minute waltz of Chopin, which is like for beginning pianist, pretty advanced song to play. So you probably can't if you just played a couple of years, it's probably not going to be a very easy song to play. But then you can play something like Bach has these like inventions that have like similar sort of techniques that you need to be able to employ later on in Chopin, or there's another waltz by Chopin that's even more complicated, uh, so but that you could basically start practicing with these like la 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 like these pretty simple straightforward practice songs that actually were created for that specific purpose, and then once you got that done, then you can give it another shot. The other way you can do it is that you can for example in music, the typical way when you're practicing a song is that you really slow down the song to the level where you can actually correct your activities using system 2. So it just go like da 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 da, just one step at a time, and then faster and faster and faster and faster. So this is the way you can tackle a challenge, the way you can optimize it based on your current skill level. And then conversely, of course, if the challenge is not interesting enough, that means that basically it leaves our system to kind of capability to wander around. This was the kind of like thesis that I presented in my postdoc work. That one of the reasons why the system 2 seems to go offline is that actually it's fully immersed in the kind of it's fully focused on the kind of like task at hand. So I mean, because you don't become non-conscious in flow, you don't just blink out and go like, hey, where did 2 hours go? You are kind of like more you have this sense of immersion, and then you go like, how could that have been 2 hours? So it's a different, if
Is
you've
it
ever
kind of
lost.
like a quietening down of the system too,
Yeah.
almost? Because that's what it feels like, right? It feels like there's most of the time we have this like chatter in our brain, that kind of like self-consciousness and that self-talk. And then in it, when system one is more online and we're in flow and we're more intuitive, that sort of quietens down a bit.
Yep. And so I mean, I think if you think about quietening down, system 2 is usually especially the reflection is based on running conceptual operations. In other words, differentiating that this thing is different from this thing, and here are two hands, so this hand is different from that hand. And the interesting bit is that you can't make those differentiations if you don't have the concepts. So if I, showed you, for example, this bottle of water, and there could actually be two different liquids mixed here, but because we don't have the conceptual understanding, we're just seeing a single liquid there. But then if somebody was actually very well versed, I think a better example is if you look at something particle accelerator experiments in some large hadron collider, for most lay people, they just look like squiggles, like, they don't really make much sense. But then when you're a particle physicist, you can actually, like, you can see, like, okay, so there's the Higgs boson, and
So
there's,
is
like,
that pattern recognition?
yeah, exactly.
Because I
And so
guess the
that's
same in climbing is, you were talking before about like we try the different grips a bunch of times, but in reality, we generally just try it like two ways because we already have the expertise and the knowledge and the pattern recognition to go, my hand will only fit in this hold in a few different ways, and I'm going to try those different ways.
Yep. But so I mean, the interesting thing is, like, because system two is so constrained in terms of information flows and information processing, that means that we have to be able to differentiate. But for system one, like, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the 11.2 million bits per second that Zimmerman presented is, like, kind of like, it's a huge understatement. Like, I mean, and theoretically, like, the upper limit is that if you have like many neuroscience research points towards this interpretation that the synapse could work as a logic gate. So basically, it either passes through current or it doesn't. It's not exactly like that, because then you also have neurotransmitters that either inhibit or, like, or boost the current. So in that sense, like, having that neurotransmitter cocktail does bring in a degree of complications there. But if we simplify it to just, like, that it would be just either there is current or there isn't current, the theoretical upper line of the human brain alone would be in the ballpark of 100,000 billion bits per second. So, like, and that's, I think, roughly the right type of, like, ballpark. And that means that in terms, like, I mean, that's, as a figure, that's, like, it's such a, like, insanely large number. It doesn't really make any sense from a human perspective. But it means that the system one is capable of more, like, holistic integration. So it doesn't differentiate between these, like, what is a handhold and what is a hand and what is a, liquid and whatever. But it's more kind of like just like clicking into place with, like, these different.
Yeah. So it doesn't analyze as much. Have you
Yeah.
have you done much research into different hemispheres? Is there a bit of a right hemisphere, left hemisphere difference
Uh,
with this, or is it above that? Because I've
the,
heard people talk about the right hemisphere as being more concerned with the whole and the left hemisphere more being concerned with the parts.
yeah, that's at least according to present day research, that doesn't hold at all. So it's based on this idea, because on the left hemisphere we have these Broca-Wernicke areas that have been, like, in lesion research shown to be involved in linguistic processing. So basically, if you have brain damage around, like, your left temple, uh, you'll likely experience at least some impediment in either speech production or speech recognition or understanding. So that has led to this idea that, like, the left hemisphere is more analytic than the right hemisphere is more kind of, like, holistic or creative or whatever. But that's not really corroborated by present day evidence at all. The interesting bit, though, is, like, that this kind of, like, analytic versus holistic differentiation does seem to pertain to system two and system one, which then can be, like, you can point out some of these, like the prefrontal cortex and some other areas in the brain that correlate with, but it's more than it would be kind of like, that about, like, these areas in the brain would be the analytic mind, and then these areas would be the creative or holistic mind. But even that is, like, once again, goes very quickly into neurobabble, because there you don't take into account that all of these networks are still connected with one another. So yeah, I mean, you can point out, like, it's pretty straightforward. Like, I think the sensory motor cortex is the coolest one, because that's pretty straightforward. Like, that if you shoot a magnetic pulse in the, around here about, like, in the left hemisphere, like, like a couple of centimeters from the center of your head, once you find the hot spot, you can actually disable a person's right arm for a couple of minutes. And the same otherwise, because it's cross-linked. So if you do the same thing, same spot on the right hemisphere, you can disable the left arm or the left leg, or whatever. And that's kind of cool neuro magic that you can do once you learn, like, where these things are. In the back of the head, there's, like, the visual cortex that, like, is involved in visual processing. So if you shoot a pulse there, you might go blind for a while and stuff like that. So that's kind of, like, I think pretty straightforward. But you can't really, I mean, there's still kind of this really strong heritage of this idea that the brain is kind of modular, that you have these brain organs, sort of like the prefrontal cortex, but the brain is the brain, right? Like, I mean, you have specialized areas that can be shown to have correlation with certain like types of sensory motor and cognitive operations, but they're not, the operations aren't actually there. And this is where you have to really go a bit philosophical about it, like, to understand that there's kind of like the concepts we use to talk about the mind and the concepts we use to talk about the brain, and there are like connections between the one and the other.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the mind is the brain. And
Yeah.
therefore, like, I mean, the whole hemisphere thing, like, I think has been pretty much conclusively shown not to hold at all. But this idea that the mind has a holistic and analytic component is still actually like supported very strongly by the evidence in dual process research. So
It's interesting. I don't know. I've read quite a bit about hemisphere stuff, and I know that there's loads of debates in neuroscience, but some of the studies are really cool. When they the split brain stuff, and Ilya McIlgrist's book is fairly compelling. That there's some differences, but I don't know. I don't really want to get into it. But what I'd like to do is just I know because I know you're short of time. I feel like we haven't maybe come across or we haven't really taken away some like practical sort of how can we better access flow with this knowledge, So I'm super interested in all this stuff, but for someone who's less interested in the neuroscience and the philosophy, what can in understanding this system 1 and system 2 a bit more, how can someone better and access intuition and flow?
That's a great question. I think there's like at least three sort of like top level things you can do. So the first thing, I think that the easiest, like lowest hanging fruit sort of thing you can do with flow is to make sure that the environment that you work with has minimal amount of distractions. So any like, basically shut off all the notifications in your phone and in your laptop. Because whenever, like, let's say that you're writing something on your laptop and then somebody sends you an email, you really don't need to look at the email at that very moment. But the link, like, that your Outlook or whatever is going to say, it's going to cut you off from the flow. So if you want to increase flow in everyday life, just like removing as many distractions as possible. Like if you have an office, work in the office. Don't work in an open office unless you have to. If you have to, wear like earplugs or like ear muffs or something like that to be able to shut down the noise. If you need to focus on something, try to work in a space that has a minimal amount of distractions on the wall. Interestingly enough, also, if you want to do creative work, you actually want the reverse. So you want to have lots of like things on the wall that like spark imagination. And then one more thing is like there's this effect called the Zeigarnik effect, named after this Russian psychologist Luma Zeigarnik from 1920s, and she discovered that basically we remember unfinished tasks better than finished tasks. So especially if you have a large workload, which most people these days do, like learning to use this kind of like systematic task management, like sort of not just a to-do list, but something like David Allen has this method called getting things done, and Leo Babauta has this methodology that's like simplified version of it called Zen to Done. So one of these methodologies you can use to sort of like to offload unfinished business from your system 1 to some kind of a to-do list system. But there's a caveat to this, so you really do need to have a little bit more intricate system than just writing down a to-do list, because the to-do list itself, then once you're not able to complete all of those things straight away, becomes another stressor. So it's kind of like that's why I think both David Allen's and the Babauta systems are like great way to manage that. Then the second, so the first thing is just like avoid distractions as much as you can, remove them. And what I teach all my students is like that turn off all notifications from your phone apart from phone calls and text messages, because like otherwise you'll lose a lot of like amazing flow moments just because your phone tells you that your pet dragon is about to hatch, and like you really don't need that information probably like right then and there. Then the second thing is learn at least like the kind of like most rudimentary, like in terms of intuition, the most rudimentary like cognitive biases. So things like that we tend to overgeneralize, like I mean racism is the worst example of that. Like we tend to overgeneralize over like like minority groups because they have signifiers that like basically associate them with negative behaviors of single individuals in minority groups. So we really need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of anchoring effects. So somebody asks you, like, would you be willing to pay like $100 for this? Well, how about 90? So people go like, well, 90 sounds cheap. If they ask, like, would you be willing to pay $10 for this? Well, how about 90? Everybody's going to go like, hell no. So basically, like, just what's the like anchoring of your current situation? What are your expectations with, for example, some like, numerical figures, pricing, research findings, whatever. And we tend to tend to be inclined, like even like super smart Harvard level students tend to be inclined to find the kind of solution from nearby the anchoring figure. I think there was even a research where they used a roulette board to just randomly generate, a roulette wheel to randomly generate like numbers. And even there, like super well trained, like, scientific people would anchor their like, findings to that random number. And there's a bunch of these. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a great tool to employ there. And then one more thing is like, so in my
What
book,
about movement stuff? Because a lot of this is like cognition, right? What about movement?
yeah, movement wise, so a couple of things to keep in mind. So first is like, that I think it really boils down to that you want to like, figure out what types of activities are intrinsically motivated to you, or so what kinds of activities are you willing to sort of go the extra mile because you're personally vested and interested in them. So because with flow, the problem is like, first of all, you have to find the challenges that enable you to get into flow. But then you also have to maintain a high level of motivation that whenever you get thrown out of the flow, when the challenges become too much. That's why the first thing is that, I mean, not everybody's going to be a rock climber, but if you find that that's something that really fires you up, then you should like go with that, and then somebody else can become an ice skater, and somebody else can become, I don't know, a guitarist or whatever. Like, so I'm just figuring out what activities are like intrinsically interesting to you, and then once you've identified those activities, then try to find like this kind of like personal growth path so that you can find increasing opportunities for improving your skill set and increasingly difficult challenges in that field. And it really has to never end. Like once you've got it, there's a really great masterclass by the cellist Yo-Yo Ma, where he's still like, telling about how he's practicing this, playing the cello, even though he's one of the most renowned cellists in the world. So I mean, even at that level, you can still find new ways of like, how to grapple the instrument. And like, even if you've climbed Mount Everest, like, 5 times, you can still figure out like some other challenges of how to do that. So that's I think. So in a nutshell, just try to figure out what are interesting, motivating activities to you, and then once you figure them out, just keep on looking for new challenges as you go ahead. And then if the challenge becomes like too much, so if you go into the kind of anxiety zone, then try to figure out a similar but less challenging task to perform, like in the example where I was explaining about learning about.
And that's because, right, like we want to get the challenge level right, because when the challenge level's wrong, system 2 comes online.
Yeah.
So if it's under challenged, it's that bored chatter, and if we're over challenged, it's that anxiety, something's wrong and we need to change something about this situation.
Yeah, and I think like, so I think there is this kind of Goldilocks zone where the system 2 is fully immersed in the task at hand. And if it's too much, we have to start troubleshooting. If it's too little, it's exactly like you said, like, the system 2 sort of starts looking for other, interesting things around, and you get this kind of mental matter or flow. But hey, there's one more thing I want to share. So this is from my book, because this I found like super useful, because intuitions are really sneaky in the way. I think you said it previously already, like, that intuitions may be wrong. And so there are actually like, there are pretty well-known constraints where you can rely on these intuitions, and situations where you simply cannot rely on them and you have to use your technique mind. And so I built this kind of like decision-making tree in my book, which starts with this kind of like aha moment. You get like an immediate, clear and forceful idea, something that kind of like, feels like, oh, wow, now I got this. And it may be like, it may be a solution to a problem. It may be a creative insight. It may be like, hey, I really got to go talk to that person this party or whatever, like, so you just get this like sort of, I think it's like the phenomenology of intuitions and flow is quite similar. You get this kind of like like whoa, like sort of like I feel like personally, like there's kind of like almost like a sun lighting up in my chest, sort of like feeling like in both cases. And it's kind of like I have no idea what the physiology is about that, but that's since I was a kid, that's always been the thing. But that kind of like you get it's a different kind of like aha moment than if you're kind of like consciously cracking a button. It's just like comes, like I said in the beginning, it comes out of nowhere. So okay, there we go. We have this aha moment. So the first question is this actually intuition, so expertise and experience driven, or is it instinct, so basically driven by DNA? And instinct, concerns things like energy intake, fight or flight behavior, like sexual behavior, stuff like that, which are kind of like, we all have that encoded in our DNA. So we have this kind of like default approach, like, that somebody shows you like a bowl of chocolate, and the default rate, like, the default genetic approach is, oh, yummy, like, energy. But, in this day and age, probably the smart thing to do is not to jump on all of that chocolate, like, that's available to you. And like, because the shops are chock full of it, like, then like, we would become quite like, well, unhealthy in that situation. So if it's an instinct, if you can identify one of these like typical instinctual behaviors, like you get your emotion flushed, you get upset about somebody, you want to punch them in the face, but probably you shouldn't, right? You want to eat something, you get these kind of like, these primitive feelings about some situation. So then the best strategy is to stop and to reconsider and use your system to your algorithm to think like, okay, so how much chocolate have I had today? Like, okay, I've already had like one chocolate like Mars bar, like, back at lunch. So maybe probably not. So thank you very much, but no. So you can use your system to navigate. But now if you can identify that it is an intuition. And the next question, this is really cool, by the way. This is the collaboration from Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein, who used to be like at odds, like they had two sort of like seemingly different theories about this. Then they decided to write a paper together, and they built this beautiful, like, collaboration that actually, like, sort of combines the best of both worlds. And the second question is that, are you talking about the domain? So is it kind of like, the the environment, the area, the intuition concerns, is it predictable? So if it's like a rock face, if it's like, like Gary Klein's example, if it's a burning house, if it's like, if it's a hockey game, if it's an academic debate, if it's one of these things where that there are enough regularities that you could have learned these system on heuristics, then you can probably rely on that. But if it's a domain like the stock market, for example, where the kind of like systemic feedback loops are just so insanely complicated that the predictability is like, nigh impossible, then, probably you shouldn't use your intuition, because your intuitions just can't parse all of that kind of like random information. And basically, the crux of it that you couldn't have learned you couldn't have learned the appropriate heuristics like the hand-holding to navigate that environment, because the environment, the rock face that just constantly keeps on changing. So even if you learn the handhold that works now, like 5 minutes later, will have changed into something else. So it's just not possible for a system one to adapt to that. So that's when we need the conscious mind again. Then the next question is that, okay, so you have intuition, you have domain validity. So do you as a person have enough like history with this area? Have you been climbing rocks enough? Have you been putting out fires enough? Are you like in Gary Klein's example, there's this kind of like fireman who just all of a sudden like yelled between, like they were putting out the fire in the house and they were in the house, the fireman, and then he yells like, everybody out now. And everybody runs out and the house collapses. And then when people ask, how did you know? And the fireman says, I have absolutely no idea. I just knew we have to get out of there. So this is a great example, like, so you have somebody who's been doing this for years, so who has built this highly intricate stack of heuristics. So, like, that I smell something, so that means something, and I hear something, and that means something, but you're not really consciously aware of those heuristics in play. And then some of those heuristics like latch on to those environmental factors that signify that the house is about to blow. And the way the mind works, it might not signal to you this analytic proposition that because you heard this and because you smell this and because the floor feels like this, you have to get out. You just get the emotional like now out, because I mean, if we didn't get that, evolution would have made toast out of us. So you need to have expertise. And then, like, if you're this far, so intuition appears, you have domain validity, you have expertise, then you can still, sort of like smoke check, or like, just quickly check your intuition against the known biases. So does it have anchoring effects? Does it have some, like, bandwagon effects? Does it have some, like, these racistic biases or something like that? And if it's none of these things, then even if your rational mind tells you the opposite, even if your rational mind tells you that, there's nothing wrong with this house, we still have like 15 minutes before we can put out the fire, so let's just do it. So even if your rational mind is at odds, if you can pass through these 4 gates, intuition, domain validity, expertise, and absence of biases, then most cases you should just trust the intuition, and you'll probably figure out later on also analytically why that was the case, as was the case with the fireman with Great Fire.
That's really interesting.
Right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's probably some really cool like things to explore in the realm of like risk decision making there, and decision making when you're like in an uncomfortable yet safe environment, because like in climbing, like people often get afraid when it's still safe technically, in the sense that they probably won't hurt themselves physically, but there's a lot of psychological discomfort and that can really affect their decision making. But I know you're short of time, so we won't get into that. But yeah, thanks so much. That was really really interesting and hopefully helpful.
Yeah, hope so. Thanks.